All right. Just opening up the YouTube connection. Give me 1 minute. Yeah, all good. So thank you everyone for joining. Let's just start while other folks are joining. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining the BizKnight Product series. As you all know that we are into the BizKnight Product series, which is a series of 10 episodes from February till November on the theme of product management. So that's what BizKnight Product series is all about. It's open both for thought workers as well as everyone outside ThoughtWorks. So it's public. So anybody can join from anywhere in the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Please spread word to your friends as well on the product series. I think we are on the second episode of BizKnight Product series, where the first episode we began with building 0 to 1 products, which was presented by Sundar Ganesan. And today we have such an interesting episode, which is behavioral science in products, which will be taken by Junofy Anto Rozarina. So Junofy is there with us, hoping to fill all the episodes in the coming way. With that, we'll just talk briefly about what's BizKnight's participant experience would look like. I think across all the comms, whether it's comms which is happening within ThoughtWorks or comms in the ThoughtWorks social handles like LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, you'll come to know about the event. Now, registering for the BizKnight Product series is just a one-time thing. So you can just come to the BizKnight website and register for the BizKnight Product series. If you've already registered, you don't have to do it every time. You will receive the event details at the right time. So you come here and register for the BizKnight Product series. That's step one. Followed by, you'll receive the confirmation email once you've registered for the BizKnight Product series. And then when the event is open, you'd also receive the invitation for each event, for each episode. After the event is over, after this has happened, probably you can attend online or you can watch the recording. You can attend live or watch the recording, after which you'll also receive the take the quiz option, where whatever you've learned, pretty much aligning to the context, you'll get a quiz. And we have Avatorians concept introduced for the quiz. For every episode, there are different Avatorians, which is coming up. Last episode, we had the water-themed Avatorians. This episode, we are having fire-themed Avatorians, which is all wonderfully designed by our designer, Joshua. Now, after you attend the quiz, it would be a chance for you to unlock the Avatorians, which would be the 5th email that probably you would be receiving. So this is the experience of participant experience of BizKnight. And today we have the episode 2 of BizKnight Product series, which is on behavioral science in products, where we would understand how to really understand human problems and needs to build products using behavioral science and psychology. And who else can we really find other than Junofy for this session? So Junofy Anto Rozarina is the behavioral scientist from Swiggy. She is an expert in behavioral economics, decision-making, and strategic thinking. She is also a seasoned researcher, public speaker, and consultant with a passion for training and providing behavioral science consultancy to large organizations. She is also the founder and CEO of India Behavioral Economics Network. It's such a wonderful community, I tell you. You can follow people who are part of that community. It's a vibrant non-profit promoting behavioral economics in the Indian subcontinent, the community itself. So with that short introduction, probably I'll hand it over to Junofy herself to take it from there. Over to you, Junofy.
Thanks, Divakar. Awesome. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Cool. So I think we got a really good intro already. But just to set a little bit of context so you know what kind of questions I'd be most suited to answer. I'm currently a behavioral scientist at Swiggy and UNICEF, and the founder bit was already spoken about. I've worked with a lot of companies, and if you see, there is a wide range of orgs there. So there's a lot of for-profit corporates. I've also worked with development organizations, with universities, with the government, and so on. And what it does is that it just gives you like a nice overview of how various organizations work. And what I'm trying to give in this particular presentation is trying to bring in the best practices from all these various learnings that I've had. And I'm going to talk about how you can apply that specifically for products. So this is what the agenda is. We'll start off with just what behavioral science is and what it entails. And then I'll give you a quick idea of what various tools that you can use in behavioral science are. We'll follow this with how you can apply that and the exact steps one can follow to apply behavioral science, all these tools that you learn to improve your products. So let's get started. So behavioral science is basically an intersection of psychology and economics. And I usually put it out as microeconomics because microeconomics studies decision-making, preferences, and so on, which is exactly the part that we'll be looking at in behavioral science. And we try to understand how people make decisions. We break it down to sometimes to the neural level, what parts of the brain gets activated and everything. And there's a lot of research that's been done. That's not what we're going to be talking about. We're just going to take all the insights that other people have done, and we're going to see how we'll apply it. And of course, the good part of this is that when you understand how people think and make decisions, you can also try and influence these decisions, which is the most interesting part we'll be talking about. Cool. So let's start with how we make decisions. Let's just imagine this context where, let's say you're really, really full, but you're at a movie theater. You feel like having a very small snack. You're really full. And these are the options that you see. Can the folks on the Zoom call please send a message saying which one you'd buy, A, B, or C? So these are in Indian rupees. So I think the A is like $2 in case someone's from some other places. Okay, cool. So we have all kinds of answers and you can see what the answers are, right? Now let's slightly change the context. Let's assume now these are the options that are given to you. If you see that this price is kind of changed. So you're still in the same scenario, you're really feeling full and you have to buy a popcorn. Which one are you going to buy now? Awesome. Cool. Thanks. So what this does is that, so now we basically just increase the price here. We have not touched A and C. What happens is that in a scenario where someone's really full and the actual preference is to buy A, which is just a little bit of popcorn, when you include something like this, which is a really, really cool option in your opinion, and this is what we call decoy. When you include something like this, people's preference changes from A to C very often, right? And this is what we call as a decoy. And this is a very, very simple example of how our preferences actually quickly change with an option that we probably never even considered picking often, right? So what happens here? Like if you very rationally have a preference, you would pick the same option every single time, right? But that's not how our brain works. Our brain works and our options change based on our mood. Tea people sometimes drink coffee, coffee folks sometimes drink tea. You're, probably more motivated in the morning than evenings. So our preferences keep changing with time. And let's see why that happens. So we basically make like 35,000 decisions every day. These are just choice decisions that we make, right? And just imagine how much load this would take in our brain. It's a lot of these. There's just a lot of things happening. Imagine making all of these decisions consciously. Imagine every time you have to take a stairs or a lift, you're actually stopping there and thinking, okay, so what are the good things about do a quick cost benefit analysis of taking the lift, taking the stairs. None of us do that, right? We just like run on autopilot. So in behavioral science, we call this system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 thinking is this very intuitive, instinctive, very quick autopilot thinking, which entails about 95% of the choices we make every day or the decisions we make. So most of our decisions every day is actually on autopilot. And we do have certain decisions where we take it slow, logical, we think about it, make decisions and so on, right? And again, these mental shortcuts that we take, for example, let's say I always take the lift up, but I climb the stairs down. If that's the person I am, I just keep doing that, right? So that's a mental shortcut. I'm not making these decisions multiple times. I just made it once and I'm going to stick to it. So these shortcuts are called heuristics. So just these two terminologies, which people constantly confuse, which is why I put it here. But these heuristics are sometimes really good, right? But when this heuristic leads to some bad preferences or some incorrect preferences, this is where we call it as a bias, right? We'll see a lot of examples, so let's just chill if that's not super clear. Let's see how we actually got to this mental shortcut way of thinking. So imagine there's this whole evolutionary explanation. So what they say is that we are all descendants of people who made mental shortcut decisions. So imagine you're hearing a very, very loud sound, and you're this caveman living in the ancient times. You hear a very loud sound. Let's say one person just runs and climbs a tree because they're scared. Another person is a more logical thinker who stops and looks at the animal and sees, oh, so this is a really large animal, so this could be dangerous. Maybe I've seen this other animal that ate my brother that was as big as this one, so maybe this one's, if you stop and think, that animal is going to eat you up, right? So all the people who survived were people who made these very quick decisions very instinctively. So we are all sort of descendants of such people, and those are the people who survived, right? So this is one of the explanation for why we have all these mental shortcuts and heuristics. But of course, the even more widely accepted explanation is just that it's impossible for us to sit and make all those 11,000 decisions every day. And it's just not logical. And to just show that, I constantly show this example to my students where, let's say you're going to buy a shampoo. How do you pick shampoo? So what are the various factors one can take into account while picking a shampoo? Just write it on the chat. So what are different things you look at? I'll start. So price is something you could look at. Most purchased one, yes. Brand, color, reviews, hair type, familiarity, purpose. Yes, so there's a lot of things we could look at. Oh, there's a lot coming up. So this is a very long list of matching your hair type with the brand, with the price, with the ingredients and everything. But how do we actually choose shampoos? Very often we just pick the same shampoo that we've used forever, right? And a lot of people, there's actually research that shows that people use the same soap that their parents introduced them to. So we pretty much just run on autopilot a lot, and that's a good thing. Anyway, so this is Dan. If someone doesn't know Dan Ariely, just look him up. He's an awesome writer and a very fun behavioral scientist. So I'm just going to read this out. Our irrational behavior are neither random nor senseless. They're systematic. We all make the same types of mistakes over and over. The product opportunity lies in helping people not make those mistakes. So what he's trying to say is basically that we are predictably irrational. So we are irrational. We don't sit and make all these rational decisions, but it's very predictable. So that's a good thing, right? So if you're very unpredictably irrational, there's nothing we can do about it, but we're predictably irrational. We all know that we all want to go to the gym. We all know that we're not going to the gym. We all know that we want to read. We all know that we're not reading. So it's super predictable, right? A lot of our behaviors. So let's now come to the second part of tools. So just to give you a couple of tools in your hand so you can start working. So what are these tools going to be like in behavioral science? So I'm just going to give you a bunch of very common and kind of interesting heuristics and biases, just a couple of them. So there's some 500, 600 of them. I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 of them. So just something to get you started. Okay. So how many of you think that your driving skills are better than average? So if you drive and you think your driving skill is better than average, then say yes. If you drive and you think your driving skills is worse than average, say no. Awesome. Cool. So this is the data that is generally observed. So about 80% of people think that they're better than the median driver. But in reality, only 50% can be better than the median driver, right? So we are often very overconfident, and we see this behavior a lot in stock market trading and all of that a lot, but also in terms of people skipping onboarding, for instance, for certain products. We see this when employees estimate the amount of time they would need to do a project. So we are often very overconfident about certain things where we probably shouldn't be. So decoy effect, we already saw this. So this was the popcorn example we saw, where the introduction of a third option or changing the price of a third option, a decoy, actually switches your preference. So this is decoy effect. This is a really interesting effect, and this is used a lot in pricing. So yeah, this is a very similar example of how coffee, if let's say you just have these two options and you think this is too expensive, but if a third option, a middle option is introduced where the price is so close to the large one, you might just end up and go buy the large one, right? This is also seen in iPhones. So Apple also uses the Decoy effect for their pricing. We see this a lot. This is super common. PVR uses it in all their theater pricing. So it's super, super common, and it actually works, right? So this is the Economist subscription plan. So when they had just these two subscription plan, they also ran tests, A/B testing. So when they just have these two, most people ended up buying the 60 rupee plan, which is only the online access. They introduced this middle option called print subscription. Nothing else changed, but suddenly, because it's the same price as print, press, web, people started buying the second option. So this option just sold so much more. So what do you do if you want to upsell? You could just probably include a middle option that nobody's going to buy, because why would someone buy this print subscription? See, it's $125. Print plus web is also $125. So nobody's going to buy this. But this option just upsold their print plan so much. So it's crazy how human brain works, but it predictably works this way. And that's the most interesting part for us. Awesome. So status quo bias, it's also known as the default bias. This basically says that whatever is the default option that's picked for you, we very often just stick to it. I don't know if you all have noticed when you're booking flight tickets or train tickets, bus tickets as well. Sometimes they just already pre-select the insurance and keep, and they ask you to opt out of it rather than opting in for an insurance. This just converts a lot of people to actually take the insurance. So they would literally have options saying something like, no, I do not want insurance. No, I'm willing to take the risk. No, it's okay. Like, I am willing to lose everything, kind of options that they give you to opt out of the insurance, where most people, we don't do it. Because imagine you actually lose your bag. It's just going to be so painful that you literally unclicked that and said you don't want it, right? So that plus just the friction, people mostly don't opt out of it. So there's an interesting example of blood donation. In a lot of European countries, what they did was it's actually organ donation, not blood donation. So by default, they decided that everybody would be registered as an organ donor, but it's optional. Like, you can always opt out of it and say, I don't want to donate my organs, right? So what happened was that some countries made it default opt-in, as in default organ donor, whereas some countries said by default, you're not an organ donor, you can come and sign up for it. This is what we observe. These are the countries where you have to go and sign up to be an organ donor, and these are the countries where you're already registered and you can just opt out. So little people actually opt out, right? And if you look at these countries like Germany and Austria, for instance, is so similar in terms of culture and everything. So it's actually very shocking. But there's one other thing that you need to look at, just think about in this particular example, is that just because someone is an organ donor doesn't mean they'll actually donate their organ, right? So you could just be registered and you might have just not bothered to opt out of. But yeah, this is very powerful, and we've seen this across various products in the past. Another thing I want to talk about, I've specifically picked this because we use incentives a lot. We give free coupons, we add deals and everything. And it's very important to know something about incentives. Incentives work really well. It increases good behavior super well, and it's very effective. Sometimes it doesn't really work, and sometimes it works in a bad way. So when it works in a bad way, we call it perverse incentives. So it's just a word of caution when you're designing incentives. I'll give you a couple of examples. In China, they found that there was a lot of, long time ago, they found that there was a lot of dinosaur fossils in a lot of places, and they wanted to collect it. But there were lots of villages that were already settled and they had their houses and everything. So the people couldn't really, the archaeologists couldn't go around and collect all of that. So they told the villagers that, hey, if you pick a fossil, find a fossil and bring it to us, we'll pay you X amount of money. But what they didn't do is, they didn't say if you bring a large fossil, we give you a lot of money, small fossils, less money. They just said for each fossil, we give you X amount of money. People just started collecting fossil, breaking it into multiple pieces. They'll just go give so many pieces and get a lot of money. And this is exactly the opposite of what they want, right? So it's just very important to be a little careful. Another example is eradication of rats in Vietnam, and a similar cobra problem actually happened in India, where the Britishers said, if you catch all the cobras and bring it to us, we'll give you money. And again, people started breeding cobras, and in Vietnam, they started breeding rats. So it's very important to be a little aware of what all it could trigger. So most behavioral science interventions can actually trigger a lot of other things. So, and we non-consciously keep using a lot of these behavioral science principles. So it's very important to also see what could potentially happen. So this is the actual blood donation study. This is a super interesting study where a hospital decided that people aren't donating enough blood. So we're going to start incentivizing people to donate more blood. So they started giving people some money and all of that to donate blood. This is the results of the study. So the number of donors went up. A lot more people started donating blood. But the people who were regularly donating blood earlier, they stopped donating blood. And the quality of blood was so bad. Lots of blood had drug detected in it, lots of alcohol detected in it. So what happened here was that the people who just went to donate blood out of goodwill stopped donating blood because it kind of now felt like selling blood, which is not what their intent was. But then a lot of poorer people who just wanted the money started going and donating blood, right? So this concept in psychology is called warm glow. You get a warm glow when you do something that you feel very happy about. So let's say you are doing some sort of charity or helping a friend out, you feel this warm glow, and that actually drives us to do a lot of behavior. So so this incentive basically removed that warm glow. One last study in incentive is Israeli daycare study. This is really interesting again, where so basically they just wanted people to pick up their children sooner because a lot of parents would come a little late to the daycare to pick up the children. So they said, hey, we're going to put a fine. If you're coming late, you have to pay this fine. This is what happened. So this is the control group. Most parents are arriving about 10 minutes late. Whereas when there was a fine, most parents started arriving 20 minutes late. Can someone guess what happened?
The fine was less than the the amount paid for per hour charges. So they were ready to have the kids stay longer at the daycare, probably.
Right, exactly. So now you no longer felt guilty of, making the poor teacher stay a little longer, and you're paying for it, right? So people would just very confidently and very happily come a little later because now they were paying for it. So they didn't have any guilt associated with it. So this is again something that I've noticed with my friends as well when they park in no parking zones. They're like, see, we are really, really late. There's a very low probability of us getting a 500 rupee fine. And if we do, I think it's worth it. Let's leave it in the no parking zone, right? Where you're now just happy to pay the fine because you feel it's a price that you're willing to pay to park there. Again, another perverse incentive. Awesome. Let's move to the next one now. So social proof is where you're doing something just because you see everybody else is doing that, right? Because you're rationalizing that if everyone else is doing it, then it must be right. And this is a very good thing because it works a lot of times where it's just good to follow the crowd sometimes, especially if you're in a new city, if you're in a new workplace, it's just good to follow what everyone else is doing. But sometimes it could be bad as well. This is also known as the bandwagon effect, the herd behavior, and so on. You might have seen this a lot. You might have used it in your products as well, where you talk about, all your brand credibility, saying, people are all talking about us, people are tweeting about us. You might have seen these as well, where they talk about, how many years they've been in business and followed by how many customers they have, how many followers they have. And these are all social proof. And even the small numbers in, let's say, Twitter follower count is a social proof, right? So you can use all of that as a social proof to denote either your credibility or to just say that this is the right thing to do. Some ads that say things like smart people use, because I work for Swiggy, I'm going to say Swiggy, but something like smart people Swiggy, that's a social proof, right? So you're trying to associate yourself with a particular group and follow that group. So yeah. Awesome. Let's just do a very quick recap of the tools we have seen. That's all I'm going to cover for today in terms of the biases and heuristics. So we saw what overconfidence was. We saw what decoy effect and how it works. Status quo effect, which is the default. Perverse incentives. We saw how incentives could be bad sometimes. We saw how social proof works. And as I said, there's like 500 more. But this is a good start. I would ask or suggest you to read a couple more, maybe like 20 or something is already really, really good to start off with. And you can already start applying it in your work. Awesome. So let's start off with the application part, which is discussing where you can apply behavioral science in your organization. I'm going to go very quickly through this because we don't have a lot of time. So firstly, of course, leadership uses a lot of behavioral science. In strategizing, you need to use a lot of behavioral science. This also happens when you're acquiring a company, merging everything. Marketing folks use a lot of behavioral science. I think marketing and sales is pretty obvious at this point. HR uses a lot of behavioral science in terms of hiring, onboarding really well, making people stay for longer and everything. Design and product, these are the two things that we're going to focus a little bit more on today. And personally, I think product integration with behavioral science is the most powerful thing and the most needed thing, in my opinion. Of course, there are other things, including like building good habits, writing emails. How do you name your company? How do you manage people better? How do you write emails that are really convincing? How do you negotiate better? How do you resolve conflicts? Even how do you make friends? So behavioral science like really covers and touches upon all these things, because anywhere where humans are involved, where people's brain is involved, thinking is involved, feelings are involved, behavioral science would play a role, right? So that's like a good rule of thumb to start off with. In terms of product itself, there are two main categorizations that we have. The initial thing is, let's say you're trying to actually come up with a new product. Here you would do user interviews, try to understand the beachhead market and everything. So that is one side of behavioral science use, where we use a lot of behavioral science. The other side is product optimization and fixing certain problems. So I will be focusing a lot more on this second part of, let's say you already have a product that's running, you're just adding some extra features, reducing some features, modifying it, so on. Right? So, okay, cool. So now let's actually go to the last part of this presentation, where we just walk through the steps of how one can apply behavioral science step by step. Let's start with an example. We'll use the same example throughout to understand how you can use these steps. So let's assume that we built an app that has very short upskilling lessons that people can take every day, like 2-minute, 5-minute lessons that they can take. A lot of people have registered, but they're really, really not using our app. But we know that our app is really cool in the sense that the lessons are really interesting. It's very useful. And we have seen that it improves people's soft skills, whatever skills we are teaching, right? And we want to change this. We want people to actually start using our app. So this is the problem that we are working with. And I intentionally made it very abstract and broad, because the first step of behavioral science research or any research is making the problem very specific and knowing exactly what you're working on. I'm pretty sure you've all done it in your work as well. So that's usually the first step, defining the problem. Secondly, the second step is sort of understanding all the behaviors around it. So this is called behavioral mapping. And then we come up with intervention. So this is the part that people usually directly jump into. I would say never do that. I've been doing behavioral science for years. I don't do that. I always start with step one. And then, of course, testing and scaling. I'm not going to be talking about that because you all know that. We'll be focusing mostly on the second and third because that's the newish part. Awesome. So let's start. So again, problem statement. This is the only thing here, only takeaway is that it has to be super, 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 super clear. Very, very specific problem statement. So the way I would suggest someone to go about is have certain outcome variables you're looking at. So what exactly is the outcome you want? And always have one key outcome. I'll tell you why this is important. You can have other sub-outcomes, like other outcomes you're interested in. Why is this important? I'll give you an example. So in the past, I've worked with this particular chat bot and the way it interacts with users and so on. There are two things chatbot, for example, at Swiggy does. One is give you reimbursement, like refunds and all of that. The other thing is make you feel happy, like some sort of customer satisfaction. These are the two goals they're chasing, right? Two outcomes we're chasing. One is CSAT, customer satisfaction. The other thing is how much money we're actually giving to the customer. Let's say they're asking me to optimize these bots and make it better. There is a chance that if I just stop giving refunds, the satisfaction is going to go down. But then if I'm just being super nice, pleasing, and all of that, and actually give them the money and all of that, we're going to burn a lot of cash, right? And often the problem statement is, hey, make this better. That is the worst way to start, right? Have one key outcome, because a lot of outcomes are very contradictory. And it's very, very important to know what you're working towards. And you can have other sub-outcomes. So for example, let's just say I don't want to affect the amount of money Swiggy is paying the customers. So I'm just trying to improve the CSAT. So let's say my key outcome is improving customer satisfaction. My sub-outcome can be, hey, don't spend any more money than what they're already spending. So don't move that. So that could be sub-outcomes that you calculate, but very important to have one key outcome. Awesome. So again, the reason I've bolded this increase or decrease is because in behavioral science, all the interventions are broken into two big parts. One is increase certain behavior or decrease certain behavior. For example, let's say you want to quit smoking, that goes into decreasing certain behavior. You want to go to the gym more often, increasing certain behavior. It's the same with users as well, right? Use your app more. Our case, for example, is increasing certain behavior. Awesome. So can people just type out what a good outcome or a good problem statement could be for us to start off with in this particular example that we're looking at? So our problem statement was this. Yeah, so people are not using an app. We want people to use it a lot more. Okay, cool. So we're getting a lot of potential outcomes and problem statements. The level of detail I would want you to go into, just to give you an example, is I would say something like, I want people to open the app. What is success, right? I want people to open the app and use it for at least 1 minute. So that could be a success. I could count the number of times someone opened the app and used it for 1 minute. All I'm trying to say is be very, very specific. Your problem statement or your outcome shouldn't be increasing CTR. It could be click-through rates, but it should be even more specific, right? So you just don't want people to just click on your link. You also want people to act on something there, right? So make it a lot more specific. And that just gives you a very clear idea of what you're working towards. The reason why this is important is for the second step, we're trying to understand all the behaviors around that particular issue. This is how behavioral mapping generally looks like. I always draw lines towards crime solving, because honestly, when you're working on behavior mapping, if you're doing it in a physical space, it really looks like crime solving. And I've had my parents come and tell me, what on earth is happening in this room? Are you like a secret serial killer or something? But yeah, what you're trying to do is try and understand that everything, any context that could be related to your particular behavior. For us, it's the app, right? So what are a billion different reasons why people might not be opening our app? And what are a billion different reasons why people might be just opening our app and quitting it immediately, right? So really think about it. It could be as stupid or irrelevant as someone just called them just when they opened the app, someone called them, right? Someone distracted them. Or they're in the bus and their stop came. It could be absolutely anything. Write it all down. So it's always good to start off with a billion different ideas and dumb it down to 5, then start with 5 and see if those 5 are good, right? So even in my idea board, I have such embarrassing things written there. It'll just look so dumb and so unrealistic. But that could happen for 1 out of 100 customers. And I think it's important to capture that, right? So yeah, so let's say you just say behavior mapping is basically just trying to understand all the behavior, what is going on there, what could be happening, everything, just thinking through the whole process, putting yourself in the shoes of all different cohorts of customers you could have and going really in detail. So this basically means that I would imagine that, okay, let's assume that I am a 70-year-old man who's now hanging out with the granddaughter. How will this person behave? Right? Let's assume I'm just a college graduate. I have very little money. How would I behave? So it's really important to put yourself in the shoes of all different customers. That'll also really show a lot of interesting patterns. Awesome. So this is the first step. You map out the entire behavior that you think could be driving this particular behavior. And for us, this end behavior we're interested in is people are not using our app, right? So what could be driving people to not use our app? Or what could be hindering people from using our app, right? Awesome. So how is this done? Like, how do you come up with these ideas? A lot of things are usually done. We do a lot of literature review. We try and dig up papers to find the specific behavior and see what others have found. A lot of corporate companies also put out their white papers where we get a lot of ideas. Talk to stakeholders. Stakeholders are anybody who's directly involved with a customer, preferably because they know the pain points, they know the anecdotes, they know what's happening there. Try and talk to the users as well to figure out what they're doing. And of course, really, really dig into the data. So when I say dig into the data, go into the nitty-gritty picky details of someone opened the app, they waited for 5 seconds before they clicked on the first thing. That data point is important. Or did they wait 15 seconds? That means something else, right? Which means they were just browsing and then they clicked on it. Did they know? So when someone immediately clicks on something, they have a particular intent and they're going towards it. For example, on Swiggy app, if I see that someone opened the app and they immediately went to a particular restaurant, started ordering, I know that they opened the app knowing that they want to go to that restaurant versus someone just opening and browsing, right? So all of this data is very important. It's not just important to know where people are clicking, it's also important to know the timing. Are people clicking slower in the evenings, mornings? What kind of users are behaving in what way? Everything. Right, I'm going to skip the activities, but I'll suggest you do all of that a little later. Just do these thought experiments, or as I'm talking, just try to imagine how this would set in your context of whatever you're working on, or in the example that we discussed earlier. And then
Junofy, there's just one question in the chat from Matthews, which is how much of user research is involved in behavior mapping? Would it be answered?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So a lot of user research is actually involved for mapping. One thing I forgot to include in that list is just rational. So the way I start off is I start by putting sticky notes of whatever I think the reasons could be. And then look at data and I add more sticky notes. I talk to stakeholders, add more sticky notes. I talk to users and I get like the craziest increase in sticky notes there because we're not good at imagining all potential scenarios, right? So I think it's very, very useful to talk to users, especially at the ideation phase, because a lot of times I know that product companies talk to users once the product is built to check if it's working well, but it's also important before you build the product. And in fact, more important before you build the product, because that's when you understand what the issue actually is. Awesome. So the next one is also more of an ideation phase, but this is the most interesting and important phase for this particular presentation. This is coming up with behavioral interventions. So I'm going to make it really simple and give you 3 different frameworks you can use to ideate, and people have their favorites. You can pick whichever one you want to follow. And I've also ordered them in order of increase in complexity, in the sense that you can see that 3 Bs basically means BBB, which itself tells you that there's just little help there. Mindspace expands to 9 different things you can think about. I'll talk about all of these in a bit, but these are just frameworks that'll really help you ideate. Okay, so 3B framework is very simple. This tries to cover the entirety of behavioral science application. First is mapping the behavior that we have already done. The second thing is, if you're trying to stop a behavior, what barriers can you add? For example, in our particular example, we are trying to make people stay in our app more, right? How can we use barriers there? We can make it slightly more difficult for people to leave the app, for example, right? So you can add barriers in a lot of places. Or when someone quits their lesson halfway, you can tell them like, hey, are you sure you want to lose this progress? You're already there, you're competing with other people. Duolingo does a lot of this. I saw someone write that on the comment as well. And Duolingo uses a lot of behavioral science. And benefits. So showing the benefits, especially if someone is working on onboarding flow, I actually have a lot of good resources for you to look at. Onboarding is a place where a lot of users drop out, and it's very painful because they're already there and they're gone. So a lot of behavioral science can be used there to really show the benefits and add barriers to stop them from dropping out. Awesome. Also, if there are any questions in the chat, please just read it out, or people can unmute and ask short questions. We don't have a lot of time, but yeah. Awesome. So secondly, let's go to the East framework. The 3B framework is just to give you an idea. I would suggest don't use that. Use either of East or Mindspace. Okay. So East basically says that if you want to drive certain behavior, make it easy, attractive, social, and timely. This seems very simple. I mean, easy, for example, is so obvious, right? Like, just don't make it difficult for them to do certain things. Make it attractive. Again, so obvious. What is social? Social is, for example, there are, I think even, let's just take the example of Duolingo again. I think Duolingo also has this community kind of thing where you can get on leaderboards, fight with other people. Another place to learn behavioral science is games. So any game you play, a billion different behavioral science concepts you can learn there. And as you read behavioral science and then play games, you'll see how they've used all of that. It's very interesting. And timely is also important. For example, I was working on a particular, also a micro-learning platform actually long ago. And we realized that most people are actually using this app on their commute to work, right? Which was not our hypothesis. We thought people were using it in the evening, which was not the case, right? So how do you make this particular, let's say, a notification you're sending? It has to be sent at the right time, right? It's very important to send a notification at the right time. Swiggy, for example, cannot send your lunch notification at 1 o'clock. It needs to send it a little earlier because it takes an hour for you to get your food, right? So it's important that whatever you're doing is also at a timely place. Yeah, just one more takeaway probably is that, you know how we ask for app permission for location, for, to view your whatever, everything on our apps. They say that the wrong time to ask it is in the beginning itself, which is usually what the apps do. But, let people just use it for a minute or two and get used to it and actually start liking it, make their experience pleasant, and then ask for permission. And a lot more people are likely to give you actually permission to even track across various apps. So it's very, very important. The timely bit is very important. And that's something that's not really followed. Easy and attractive is something people do follow. Awesome. So let's talk about the last framework. It's Mindspace. It's a larger framework, as you can see. I'll just quickly take you through the process. So Messenger is important in the sense that Messenger just means who is communicating this information to you, right? So, for example, in Duolingo, everything is by that, I don't know what that owl is called, but the owl communicates everything, right? You build a relationship with that person. Let's assume that Shah Rukh Khan is now telling everyone that this app is amazing. That means something, right? In the same way, there's a lot of research on what a credible source could be or what non-credible source could be. And I would suggest you to read that up in case you're ever using any messenger related stuff. But this is very important. Again, Messenger also works in the sense that if you create communities in your app and in your product and you make people interact with each other, that's a great messenger, by the way. Like that really works as well. I mean, of course, incentives is something we all use, so I'm not going to cover that. Social norms is very similar to the social proof concept I spoke about, herd behavior and everything, where we end up doing what everybody else is doing. So that's norms or social norms. Defaults, again, we saw that's the status quo bias or the default bias, where we really stick to the whatever preset option is there, mainly due to inertia and because of ease of use. Salience, I'm pretty sure you have seen salience. So for example, in this slide, if you just quickly show, not this slide because the slide has too much content, but if you just show a slide like this to someone, they would immediately look at this part, right? Wherever this yellow thingy is, because it's just more salient and visible. And it's very important that you don't overcrowd your page with too much salient stuff. Only the final click-through thing that you want, the final CTA you want people to look at, that's the only place where you want it to be salient, right? So benefit, click. That's how you want people to look at. And it's very possible for you to use all of that. For example, a particular app that we worked with, it was a SaaS product, where we wanted people to look at 3 different benefits in that particular order and then look at the purchase option. So what we did was we just added a small shimmer in the first reason. Immediately people would look at it. And then we gave like 3-second gap and then a small shimmer in the second reason, people would look at it. A small shimmer in the third option, people would look at it. And then the CTA comes up out of nowhere. So these kind of, increasing salience is very important because currently we are really competing for attention, right? Like there's just so much there. So it's very important to have salience. Priming is a slightly complex concept, so I'm going to skip that because we don't have a lot of time. But again, it's super interesting, and I would suggest you all to go read up about it for sure. Affect is basically just designing with emotions. So at different points of the journey in your product, in your app, whatever you're building, you want users to have certain emotions. For instance, when just before they're going to purchase your product, you want them to feel like, wow, this is really worth it. I want this, right? So triggering certain emotions is super important. Giving another Swiggy example, anybody who comes to customer support is at the worst possible emotions. They're frustrated, they're angry. That's like the most difficult kind of people to deal with. So what are the correct emotions to trigger at that point? So behavioral science plays a huge role in all of those triggering emotions part. If you're working on a flow, I would suggest you to actually think about what emotion you want to be triggered at, want the user to be at in different points in time, and then see what emotions they'll actually be at and try and map this gap. So this is super important. Commitment, people are very consistent when they make public promises. So which is why companies really like forming user communities and stuff, because people would, nudge each other to work a lot more. Lastly is ego. We do things that make us feel good. So we spoke about this warm glow concept that we feel good when we do something nice. This is very powerful. We all want to feel good. We all want to think we're great. Except when people are buying shampoos, apparently, because the shampoos that have the worst possible description sells the most. If it says something like for dry, frizzy, horrible hair, people are like, okay, that's the shampoo I want. So except honestly for shampoo, there's a lot of research that actually talks about it, but everything else, we like things that make us feel good. Awesome. Cool. Just very, very short. It's going to take a minute to just show you how interventions could actually look like. For instance, if you want people to look at the twos easier, just adding it's a very mild color, to be honest. It's not even that obvious, but it helps, right? Adding a slight angle helps. You know how I spoke about the shimmer where you're trying to capture attention? Adding a slight angle also helps. Of course, sizes, we know this already, to capture attention again. And few things are nudges and setting processes. This is really interesting. So I'll just take you through this thing. So for instance, you can either ask a child to tidy the room, or you can just say, hey, let's play a game. Let's quickly tidy. Let's see who's cleaning up faster, right? They're just going to have so much fun and actually do it. The more difficult way or the process is to count the number of calories you're eating and try and eat lesser. But there's a lot of research showing that if you have a smaller plate, you eat much lesser, right? So that's like a very easy fix. And it's so much better than sitting and counting calories, right? You can either budget your food shopping, or if you actually go to a supermarket, you can just use a small basket instead of a trolley. It really reduces the amount of stuff you buy. And the larger the trolley, the more you buy. So yeah, all of those things could be helpful. And you can just use text, of course. Here, for example, they're saying it's in high demand. So many people have booked. This is social proof, right? We saw this already. And they're talking about how there's only one room left. That's triggering scarcity. And this is also social proof where they're saying 3 people are looking at this hotel. So you can use just text comms to trigger certain behavior. It's sometimes as simple as that. Not going to go into testing, but the only thing that's important is that change only one variable between the test groups. Sometimes I've seen people use completely different test groups. That's not okay. We have been doing a lot of A/B testing. Start doing a lot of A, B, C, D, E testing, have a lot of treatment groups, try it all out, because just because it worked at, let's say, Big Basket doesn't mean it's going to work at Flipkart, right? So it's very important to actually test whatever is already working for other products as well with your customers. And again, not going to touch upon scaling because that's something you all probably already do. quick recap of what we have seen so far. We saw what is behavioral science. We saw the most common, very few handpicked biases and heuristics. We saw where behavioral science can be applied. We saw how it has like a wide range of applications. We saw how to use this. And just to quickly take you through that, coming up with a very specific problem statement, doing a nice behavioral mapping. And mapping also involves coming up with 100 different reasons and then removing the ones that don't really make a lot of sense or probably not that impactful. Coming up with interventions that are targeting each of these potential reasons that you caught in the behavioral mapping, right? So let's say you have 10 different things that you think could potentially be driving certain behavior. Your intervention could target all 10 of them, right? So that is, and we also saw a couple of frameworks to use to design these interventions. And then we have testing, and then you scale. That's it from me. Do we have any questions from you all?
Yeah, I think there are 3-4 questions in the chat. We'll begin with the first one. This is from Monica. She's asking how to avoid our own bias while doing behavior mapping.
Yeah, so it's a process you learn as you go along. For example, especially in user interviews and user research, like I've seen this a lot where, sometimes you do it with another person and people have a particular hunch in their head. So let's say you think that people are not ordering enough food on Swiggy because they're cooking at home. They would just ask questions like, do you cook at home? Like, how often do you cook at home? Do you have a cook? So you're really like diverting the conversation towards something. So that is going to give you a very biased result, right? So going with a very blank, open mind is very important. And that's something you can just learn on the go. But I usually go to these user interviews with the goal of finding 10 new things that I did not think about. And that's usually a good way to go about, because that kind of gives you like oh wow, I knew this already, I had already thought of it, or yes, I wanted a new reason, I found a new reason kind of mindset. So yeah. And yeah, behavioral mapping can be very biased. It's super important to rely on actual user research and on actual data to validate it for sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Junofy. Hope that answers the question, Monica. The next one is from Praveen. How would you influence the user behaviors into taking some action when the user themselves are not interested, aware in doing it, but then the larger organization wants the user to do it to achieve a bigger outcome, a business outcome, probably?
Okay. It's usually good if the user also wants to do some things, because otherwise then it just becomes a very paternalistic view of, I want you to do something that you don't want to do. And that has like ethical concerns, right? So I would suggest to stay away from it. But if you want people to do something that they're not super enthused about doing, but they actually want to do, for example, going to the gym is something people want to do. Staying fit is something people want to do, but it's just that we don't have the motivation to do that. In that case, you can go ahead and do all of this. But in the other case of, I would just say, don't force people to do things that they don't want to do. If that's the case, then you'll have to use actual incentives and policies to make sure that they are aligned with you and they're actually happy to do what you want them to do. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Junofy. I also like that when you said, to nudge people in a more ethical manner. So that's really such a nice thing, not push them to the edge for the business purpose. The next question is from Muskan, where she asks, once you map your behavior and you know why people are behaving the way they do, there might be multiple possible interventions. How do you choose?
Yeah. So usually it's based on like, I come up with my own framework for each project I work on. So it depends on the budget, feasibility that way. And also in terms of, do we want a short-term fix or are we looking at a more longer-term fix? So you can come up with your own framework like that. And you're very right that every time we work on something, we come up with a billion different potential interventions. It's just like categorize them into P0, P1 based on priority of how impactful they are. The cost benefit analysis. So depending on the project, different metrics would go into it. I would say just come up with some metrics like that to decide which ones you want to test first. Also another input metric there is how much conviction you have. Do you actually think this will work? Because sometimes, especially when you're experimenting with a lot of money, people wouldn't be very happy if nothing really happens after all of that. So yeah, it's usually good to do something that you're very confident would work. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So it's much more tailor-made interventions that we have to think through. I hope that answers your question, Muskan. The next question is from Atul, where Atul is asking, cannot help but think, and sorry for a direct question, how do you manage the relation with the product manager? I reckon lengthy conversations with product on the what's and whys of the next feature problem to be solved. How do you manage this, and how's the relation like?
Yeah, so we do work very closely with various product managers and also with designers, sometimes with developers as well. The whys and whats are usually actually aligned. So we have very similar thought processes, but can you like expand a little bit more on what the question itself is?
No, I meant Junofy, right? So product managers are usually bombarded with a lot of prioritization requests, and can we add this feature? Can we add that feature? And there may be stakeholders from operations or customer service, and then also a behavioral scientist, giving in their input. So what helps your conversation what helps, or what input do you give the product manager to help that person prioritize is what I was asking.
Yeah, cool. It's very similar to anybody else. We just give ROI metrics or the estimated ROI metrics for most things to convince the product managers to prioritize, let's say if I'm pitching something. But so far, thankfully, we haven't had a lot of disagreements in terms of the prioritization process itself. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Atul and Junofy. The next question is from Abhinav, where Abhinav is asking, adding to Pravin's question, in electronic medical records, which expects doctors to record consultations, the users are inherently opposed to using systems and prefer pen and paper consultation process. How do we tackle such situations? The end benefits here are not exactly for the doctor, but for the hospitals in general.
Okay, so this is the doctors preferring using pen and paper.
Pen and paper, yes. Okay. But the hospitals preferring more digital friendly equipments.
Very complex problem, like for me to just try and solve here. But again, I would say try and observe their behavior, try and figure out, especially if you see some doctors using the computer, I would say see why they're doing what they're doing. And usually the environment also matters. If you can, for example, to give you an example, certain times when you're trying to push behavioral science in my organization, for example, it's just really difficult when you ask people to just, hey, start using behavioral science, right? But if I just give you like a one-page document that says, okay, so this is the new product, they will always already work on PRDs and all of those documents, right? What if I just add one question there saying, what is the behavioral science concept that you thought about? Are you using something there? Now you're making it a part of the process, making it easier for, let's say, whoever's using it, right? So I would suggest using something very similar. So creating a space where it's actually easier for the doctors to enter it in the computer than on the paper. But honestly, an easier way to do it is to just add a rule that they're supposed to do it that way. But yeah. You can, of course, use like social proof and everything where you say, like most doctors in our hospital are actually using digital records, if that's true. Things like that. But again, as I said, I really lack the context. So it's very difficult for me to try and come up with interventions itself directly.
Thank you, Junofy. So, Abhinav, I think probably people can also follow Junofy in LinkedIn to ask, have a chat and ask for detailed information. And you can also write to Junofy for her email address. So, Junofy, there are 2-3 questions. Shall we go over them? Do you have some more time?
Sure, yeah. But if someone wants to drop off, then yeah, thanks for the
So please take feedback, everyone. Your feedback would be so much helpful for us and for Junofy as well. We'll go to the next question, which is again from Muskan. How did you change the emotion when they come to see us? What's
Customer
CS?
support, I assume.
Customer support. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, we're still working on it, but this is not going to be done at Swiggy, so I can actually talk about it. Otherwise, I'm not allowed to talk about it. But things like, let's say I just click on help and I immediately get this very cute animal that's just saying, hey, how can I help you? Small things like that actually matter. The color you're using, the kind of font you're using, how much space is there between these messages, all of these have an impact in terms of how the user feels. And also, a very good customer support conversation would include a lot of empathy in the initial phase. So it's usually, greetings and then asking what the issue is, empathy, and then fixing the issue, right? So I think that's around the time where we want the customer's emotion to change from frustration to, okay, cool, this person's going to fix it for me, kind of relief. So, yeah.
Thank you, Junofy. Thanks for answering
I just want
that.
to add one thing. There was this really interesting brain MRI study that happened in the lab I was working at, where people were made to wait for 2 hours intentionally, and they would be so frustrated by the time they entered the lab. That was an intentional thing the researchers did. They said the study was a 3-hour study, but they didn't expect to wait outside for 2 hours, right? So by the time they entered the lab, they were always frustrated. And the study involved them, putting all of those things in the head and everything, and the brain waves being studied. It was extremely frustrated. They start the study by showing various images, and some of them were just pictures of very cute smiling puppies. And you'd be shocked to see how much people's emotions just change immediately with just a picture. Immediately calm down. People immediately, the brain activity basically goes down because they're just like calmer. So yeah, small things actually help a lot. And I've seen a lot of websites in the waiting page actually add very cute pictures. And these are, in fact, very, very useful and very helpful.
All right. Thank you, Junofy.
Questions?
The next one is from Lalit. With time, behaviors change, evolve. Let's say irrational decisions are increasing in comparison to rational ones as the time evolves. Then how do we adapt to them?
I would say it's not irrational decisions that would be increasing, but it's just that we'll be doing more different kinds of irrational things. Like, for instance, my grandparents might be doing different kinds of irrational stuff versus my younger cousins are probably constantly on TikTok and Instagram, doing different kinds of irrational stuff where they really want to leave the app, but they're just so hooked to it and constantly stuck there, right? So I think the behavioral patterns itself is very similar in the sense that we've always been craving for instant gratification. We always wanted the good stuff now. We've always been postponing whatever was painful for us. It's just that in the past, they didn't have computers. Now we have computers and phones. So our behavior is still very similar. It's just that the medium is different and the way we're exhibiting it is different. So I wouldn't say we would necessarily get more irrational per se, but there are certain research that actually agrees with what Lalit says in the sense that people have become a lot more impatient now, which could drive a lot of irrational behavior. People are incapable of dealing with boredom, which is very understandable, right? I don't know. Even I remember when I was much younger, I would just spend so much time doing nothing. And it's just not very imaginable now for me to sit for a couple of hours just watching and doing nothing, right? So I think all of those things also drive a lot of irrational behavior. For instance, like checking Instagram just because I have like a 2-second break in between 2 meetings. Those things are changing for sure. But yeah, I think the general framework or the way the brain is wired, I wouldn't say we're getting more irrational per se. Yeah.
That answers Lalit's question. Next is from Suresh. I think this is the last one. How is emphasis on privacy by design affecting behavioral science data collection in the industry today? I mean, I couldn't even understand the question, so I think I'll ask Suresh to elaborate this a little bit.
I think it's more like we're no longer allowed to collect a lot of data. For instance, I think on iPhones, when you're trying to collect data across various apps, you have to give specific explicit permission. I'm assuming it's around that.
Yes, Junofy. So it's basically about more emphasis on privacy. So that limits us from the way data could be collected for studying customer behavior as we were able to do in the earlier time frame. So how is it transforming the industry today?
Right. So I agree that there's a lot more privacy concerns, and therefore the kind of data we collect is much different. For instance, I think Uber got called out for collecting information on how much battery percentage was left on someone's phone, and they hiked prices in case your battery percentage was too little, because you'd just be willing to pay any amount. In those cases, yes, there is some reduction in the amount of data collected, but I would say we still get the Pareto amount of data that we always could get. And honestly, I've worked with a lot of clients, and I'm actually more surprised that a lot of clients actually don't collect data that is right there. Like, clients sometimes don't have data on how many people clicked on add to cart versus how many people actually checked out. Basic data is actually not recorded, or I mean, it's there, but nobody has looked at it ever, and it's not clean. So I would say mostly, at least I personally don't feel an effect. I've never been in a scenario where I'm like, why is this data not available? And I actually want this to understand a certain behavior. So most of it all, we don't have certain data, which is often the case, right? Like, a lot of behaviors you don't actually capture, especially on a tech product. Then user interviews generally cover up for it, when you can just talk to a lot of people and try and understand what's happening. Again, very biased, because you can barely talk to like two-digit people, I don't know, max 20, 30 people. So it's going to be biased, but I think it does okay if you don't have the data. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool.
Does that answer your question, Suresh?
Assume sort of.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, I had a struggle when we go for user interviews, right? It's usually there is a social bias attached to it. They want to be socially correct when they want the response. They don't say what they actually intend to do against what they actually do.
Yeah, I've actually realized that despite all the benefits of having a video on, where you can actually look at their behavior, like facial expression and everything, people are more honest when the video's off, and when their names are not, like, for instance, here, if I turn my video off, I think my name would show up. So when the name doesn't show up, people are actually more honest. In which case, like, phone call interviews, for example, actually is good, especially when you're dealing with sensitive topics. Also, I would shy away from group interviews and go for one-on-one interviews. And having one interviewer is usually very helpful as well. I mean, there are just some ways to get around it, but yeah, I do empathize, and I'm sort of in the same boat there as well. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Junofy. I think pretty much all the questions are answered. Just one last question. I think there are also feedbacks in the chat. There are all lovely feedbacks in our Google chats also. People I could see in the groups, they're all kind of praising you for the session. So thank you so much, Junofy. One last question. I think this is also with respect to the behavior. For example, if you imagine that I'm a regular buyer in a food app, an online food delivery app, and then there's also a negative element which is attached to it if I'm regularly going to buy it and lose contact going to restaurants. So for example, a grocery buyer lose contacts going to the shop. And how would we actually try to balance the behavior on kind of building a responsible technology? What are your views on it, Junofy?
I'm legally not allowed to comment on it, but I can just say, as a normal person who works across a lot of companies, where the incentives are just in a way where for example, if I'm working for Instagram, what are they going to ask me? They're going to ask me to like make people stay on the app for longer. Is that something that I think is morally right? Maybe not, right? So as a behavioral scientist, I think personally, I would just avoid such projects. And at Swiggy, for instance, the behavioral science team has touched 0 projects which has anything to do with making people use the app more or making people order more. So we just take projects like reducing driver fraud reducing fake claims, or making the process easier in terms of, let's say I want to add stuff on the cart. Is it annoying to do right now? How do we make it nicer? Kind of project. So we try and ethically pick stuff that is still on our side of ethical agrees. But as a product manager, I don't think you'll have all the choice of, I'm not going to work on this, right? So I would just say, come up with your own ethical framework if your company doesn't have one. And our current ethical framework at the behavioral science team at Swiggy is that it's always customer first. And the second priority is delivery partners and restaurant partners. It's actually restaurant partners first and then delivery partners, and then comes the company. So if a goal or a business goal is contradicting a delivery partner versus the company, we would pick the delivery partner. So that's like a small rule of thumb that we have. But yeah, I know that it's a big problem, whatever you just said. And it's actually a very, very huge problem because we don't have any standardized ethical clearance or whatever right now, right? Or any ethical guidelines in place. We're actually working on it from IBAN, trying to come up with an ethical guideline for using behavioral science, because this is actually very critical. This is playing with people's decisions and emotions and behavior, right? So this is very powerful. And therefore, we would definitely have some guidelines. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that. Any other questions from anyone before we close? I think we're 13 minutes past. All right. Thank you so much, Junofy. Thanks for accepting to give this talk. It's seriously such a wonderful talk. So many new things that we have learned, and also we could really connect how much we could apply those in our work. For example, some of the user research we'll generally not go with an open mind, but we'll already be more biased. People would be answering questions in a certain way, and we ourselves would be giving a lot of leading questions, taking customers and users in a certain direction. So all of these things are actually giving us how as humans we behave, maybe consciously or unconsciously. This is such a wonderful session. Anything from your side? Do you want to say a few words before we close?
Not really. I had fun. I hope everyone got something useful out of it. And I think the success metric for me from the session is if you all start using some sort of behavioral science in your day-to-day activities. It could be talking to people, it could be in your product, anything, but yeah.
Absolutely. And we could all see so many lovely comments in the chat, which is actually the evidence of that. Thank you so much, Junofy. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you in the next talk. Have a good evening.